The hum of the pump was a lullaby, a promise of a new start, but it was drowned out by the rising wail of sirens. I watched the last of the water spiral down the drain, thinking I was finally washing away the past. That's when I saw her, Karen, her face a mask of furious triumph, 2 police officers trailing in her wake. She didn't look at me. She pointed to the empty tiled pit, and the words that ripped from her throat were not a threat, but a proclamation. "That's my pool now." The officers just stared at the bone-dry basin, and I felt the solid ground beneath me begin to crack. The chlorine hung in the still air, a phantom memory of summers past. Mark leaned on the cold, concrete edge of the pool, the dull ache in his chest a constant companion since the day Sarah was gone. He had bought this house for her, for them. The sprawling backyard, the oversized deck, the kidney-shaped pool that reflected the sky. It was all part of the dream. Now, it was just an empty monument to a life that had been snatched away. The bright blue tiles were a mockery of the sky Sarah used to paint. The smell of chlorine, once a symbol of sun and laughter, was now the scent of loneliness. He couldn't stand it anymore. He'd tried. He'd tried to have friends over, to force himself to swim, to let the water wash over him. But every time, the echo of her laugh was just too loud. The way the light hit the surface reminded him of the glint in her eye. The memories were a physical weight, pressing him down. Draining it seemed like the only way to get a breath, a cleansing, a fresh start, a chance to fill the void with something new, something that was just his, something that didn't remind him of her. He had rented the industrial pump from a local hardware store, a machine that whirred and coughed like a dying whale, but promised to empty the 20,000-gallon pool in under 48 hours. The massive hose snaked across his lawn and over the curb, a clumsy umbilical cord that was slowly siphoning the life from the backyard centerpiece. He was adjusting the filter basket when he heard the familiar, clipped sound of a screen door, slamming next door. It was a sound he'd come to associate with a very specific kind of dread. "Good afternoon, Mark." A voice, sharper than broken glass, cut through the mechanical drone. Mark straightened up, running a hand through his hair. "Deborah." "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Deborah, a woman who seemed to exist in a permanent state of offense, stood on her side of the fence, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She was impeccably dressed, as always, in a linen pantsuit that looked far too expensive for a Monday afternoon. Her perfectly coiffed blonde bob seemed to be holding its breath in disapproval. "I'm just observing," she said, her eyes flicking from the pump to the hose to the rapidly receding water line. "Observing a gross and utterly irresponsible act. Of negligence, that is." Mark sighed. "I'm draining the pool, Deborah. It's not a crime. The amount of water you're wasting. Do you know what kind of drought we're in? Do you know the ecological impact of 20,000 gallons of chlorinated water flowing into the street?" She gestured wildly as if the water were a river of toxic sludge. "That's going to wreak havoc on the local storm drains. The city has rules about this, you know." "It's going into a drain, Deborah, not a river. It's what the drain is there for," Mark said, trying to keep his voice even. "I called the city. I followed all the protocols. They said it's fine." "The city says a lot of things," she sniffed, as if the city itself were one of her lesser-liked neighbors. "I'm sure they just have some glorified receptionist giving out bad information. I, on the other hand, have read the bylaws. I'm a stickler for the bylaws, Mark, and I'm quite certain this is a violation of at least 3, maybe 4 ordinances." Mark took a deep breath. He had been through this with her before, her prize-winning petunias, his unruly oak tree, the placement of his recycling bin. Every interaction was a battle for some perceived moral high ground, a test of wills. She'd won every time, mostly because he lacked the energy to fight. But this time was different. This was about him. This was about Sarah. This was his private pain, and he wasn't going to let her contaminate it? "Look, Deborah," he said, forcing a smile he didn't feel. "It's my pool on my property. I have the right to do with it as I please, as long as I follow the rules, which I have. Please, just let me get this done." A cold, hard look settled in her eyes. "Oh, but is it truly your property, Mark? You bought the house, yes. But there's a reason the last owners left in such a hurry. Things aren't always what they seem, are they?" She said this with a knowing, infuriating smirk. Some people don't do their due diligence. Some people just move in and assume they own everything, when really they've just inherited a mess. Mark's patience, a thin veneer since Sarah's death, began to crack. "What are you talking about, Deborah? What mess?" "Nothing," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "Nothing at all. Just be careful. You never know who might have a claim on what you think is yours. A simple oversight in a survey, a forgotten easement, a verbal agreement made years ago, never properly documented." She let her words hang in the air like a threat before turning and retreating to her house, the screen door slamming with an air of finality. Mark stood there for a long time, the drone of the pump the only sound. He felt a chill, despite the afternoon sun. Was she just trying to scare him? Was this another one of her games? He thought back to the closing documents, the endless stack of papers he'd signed. He was pretty sure he had read them all, but in the blur of grief and legal jargon, who could be certain? He shook his head, pushing the thought away. It was a pool, a private residential pool. What claim could she possibly have? He decided it was just another of Deborah's ridiculous power plays. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. The next day, the pump was still humming, the pool a quarter full. Mark was sitting on the deck, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the last of the water recede from the shallow end. The bottom was littered with a decade's worth of forgotten toys, fallen leaves, and a few stray coins. It was a graveyard of memories. The sadness washed over him again, but this time it was different. It was less a crushing weight and more a quiet melancholy. He was doing this for himself, for a new chapter. Just then he heard a new sound, a sound he hadn't heard since he was a child playing in the street, the distant, unmistakable wail of a siren. His stomach tightened. It couldn't be. Not for this. He told himself it was just a coincidence, a fire truck on its way to a call, a police cruiser on a routine patrol. But the sound grew closer, louder, and then, with a jarring finality, it stopped, right in front of his house. Mark stood up, his coffee forgotten. He watched, frozen, as the police car pulled into his driveway. The door opened, and a large, stoic-looking officer got out, followed by a younger, more nervous-looking one, and then Deborah emerged from her house, a triumphant look on her face, her arm hooked through the elbow of a third, plain-clothed officer. Her expression wasn't one of a concerned neighbor, but a victor. "Officer, there he is," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too dramatic. She gestured at Mark, standing beside his half-drained pool. "That man is actively destroying my property. My emotional and mental well-being has been put at risk because of this reckless and illegal action." The first officer, whose name tag read Miller, looked from Deborah to Mark, his expression one of weary confusion. "Ma'am, he's just draining his pool." "His pool?" "Oh, no, officer," Deborah said, stepping forward, a theatrical hand-on-hip pose. "That's not his pool." She smiled at Mark, a look of pure, unadulterated malice. "That's my pool now." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the dying gurgle of the pump. The officers exchanged a look of utter bewilderment. Mark felt his blood run cold. She wasn't bluffing. This was no game. This was real. And in her eyes, he wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was a trespasser, a thief, and he was standing on ground she believed was hers. The air crackled with attention. That had nothing to do with property lines and everything to do with a quiet, private war. The game had just begun. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Officer Miller, a man whose face seemed permanently set in an expression of quiet resignation, was the first to break it. He looked from Deborah, still in her theatrical pose, to Mark, and then down. "At the dry, empty pool, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You called in a civil dispute over a pool. Now you're claiming it's your property. Can you explain that?" Deborah's posture shifted from defiant to a sort of righteous indignation. She gestured toward her plain-clothed companion, a man who had remained silent and whose face was as impassive as stone. "This is Detective Carter. He's here as an observer to document the destruction of my private property." She then turned her withering gaze back to Mark. "I don't need to explain myself to you, officer. I have the documents. The deed to this property contains a clause, a very specific, very binding clause." Mark's mind reeled. He remembered Deborah's veiled threats from the day before, her insinuation about a mess. He had dismissed it as a pathetic attempt to intimidate him, but the presence of the police, and now this detective, made his blood run cold. "What documents?" he demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and rage. "This is my house. I have the deed. I bought this property in good faith." "Oh, I'm sure you did," Deborah replied, a venomous sweetness in her tone. "But that doesn't mean you bought the whole property. The previous owners, the Harrisons, well, they were friends of mine, very close friends. And when they decided to sell to a young man like you, they made an arrangement. A verbal one at first, but then we had it put into the deed." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, but it carried clearly in the quiet neighborhood. "They had a difficult time with their pool. A lot of maintenance. And I, being the good neighbor that I am, offered to pay them for the right to use it. A sort of timeshare, if you will. It was to be a permanent, irrevocable right." The officers looked at her, then at each other, their faces a roadmap of escalating disbelief. Officer Miller sighed. "Ma'am, a verbal agreement isn't going to hold up in court, and even a written one. You need to present that to a judge. We're not here to arbitrate a property dispute." Deborah's face flushed red, a deep, angry crimson. She reached into her purse, a designer handbag that probably cost more than Mark's car payment, and pulled out a single sheet of folded paper. "This isn't a verbal agreement. It's a signed, notarized addendum to their deed, a perpetual easement on the land where the pool sits, giving me, Deborah Jane Peterson, all rights and responsibilities to the pool itself and a 10-foot radius around it for maintenance and access." She unfolded the paper with a flourish, as if it were a royal decree, and handed it to Officer Miller. Mark felt the world tilting on its axis. He watched as the officer's eyes scanned the document. He could see the officer's posture stiffen, his brow furrow. The young officer next to him leaned in, his eyes wide. The police were not dismissing her now. The paper, whatever it said, was holding their attention. "This is a mess," Officer Miller finally said, handing the paper back to Deborah. "This isn't something we can handle on the spot. It looks legally binding on the surface. We can't tell you who is right or wrong. We can, however, tell you that you cannot continue to drain the pool until this is sorted out. This is a civil matter now, Mr. Harrison. You need to get legal counsel." He looked at Mark with a pitying expression, a look that said, "I'm sorry. You have to deal with this nut job." Mark was shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, simmering rage. He couldn't speak. He just stood there, staring at the empty hole in his backyard, a hole that was once a pool and was now a legal battleground. Detective Carter, the silent companion, finally spoke, his voice low and calm. "Mr. Harrison, my advice to you is to cease all activity on this property, specifically the pool, and seek legal representation immediately. Any further actions on your part could be seen as an act of destruction of property." I'd hate for this to escalate to a criminal matter." He then nodded to his uniformed colleagues, and the three of them turned and walked back to their cars, leaving Mark standing alone in the deafening silence. The drone of the pump, which had been the only constant in his life for the past 2 days, had been shut off by one of the officers. As the cars pulled away, Deborah offered a final triumphant smirk. "Have a nice day, Mark, and please be a good neighbor and don't touch my pool." With a toss of her blonde head, she walked back into her house, the screen door slamming with a final, echoing thud. The backyard felt alien now. The half-drained pool, a symbol of new beginnings, was now an open wound. Mark walked inside, his heart pounding in his ears. He grabbed his phone and started frantically searching for a lawyer. The first 3 he called were busy. The fourth, a family friend named Ken, was an old, no-nonsense corporate lawyer. Ken wasn't his first choice, but he was his only choice at this point. "Ken, it's Mark. I have a problem." He spent the next half hour trying to explain the surreal situation. Ken listened patiently, his low voice a steady anchor in Mark's sea of panic. "So she's claiming a perpetual easement on your property, and you have no knowledge of it?" Ken asked, his voice calm and methodical. "And the police came and told you to stop draining the pool?" "Yes. It's insane, Ken. What do I do? Can she actually do this?" "Well, an easement is a real thing, Mark. It grants a non-owner the right to use another's property for a specific purpose. It's usually for things like utility lines or driveways. A pool easement is unusual, to say the least. But if it's in the deed, it's in the deed. We'll need to get a copy of the original deed and a title search. The title company should have caught something like this." The next few days were a blur of phone calls and emails. Mark had sent Ken the closing documents, the deed, and the title report. Ken, in turn, had spent hours poring over the fine print. He called Mark back a few days later, his voice tired. "Mark, this is a mess, like the officer said. The easement isn't in your deed. It isn't even in the previous owner's deed, the Harrisons', at least not the public record. But she's holding a document with a notary stamp and a signature. This could be a forged document, or it could be a private agreement that was never filed. Either way, it's a legal gray area, and Deborah Peterson is known to be a bit of a litigator. She's sued the city over her petunias, for God's sake. We're going to have to file a declaratory judgment action to quiet title, basically asking a judge to declare that the easement is invalid and the pool is yours, free and clear." Mark's heart sank. "A lawsuit? How much is that going to cost?" "Well, it's not going to be cheap," Ken said. "But we have a very strong case. The title report is clear. The public record is clear. Her claim is flimsy. It's more of an annoyance than anything else. But an annoyance that could cost you thousands in legal fees." That night, Mark sat on his deck, staring into the dark pit of the pool. The pump was silent. The water, a murky, half-full cesspool, sat stagnant. He felt a wave of despair wash over him, but this time it was different. It wasn't the despair of grief. It was the despair of a man being wronged, of a man being taken advantage of by a cruel, vindictive neighbor who was using his tragedy to fuel her own petty war. He thought of Sarah, of her kindness, her grace. He remembered her saying, "Don't let the little things get you down, Mark. It's just not worth it." But this wasn't a little thing. This was his home, his sanctuary, the last piece of her he had left. And this woman, this caricature of a person, was trying to take it from him. He couldn't let her win. He wouldn't. He went inside, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down at his computer. He pulled up the old closing documents, the endless stream of papers he had signed. He scrolled through them, page after page, looking for anything at all that could give him an edge. There was nothing. Just the standard boilerplate. He then, on a whim, decided to search for Harrison Pool Sale and Deborah Peterson. And easement. He found dozens of results about her lawsuits against the city, against other neighbors. But then, an obscure link caught his eye. It was a local news article from a few years back titled, "Neighbors Feud Over Shared Driveway. Ends in Arson." He clicked it. The article was old, but the names were clear. The Harrisons, his previous owners, and a neighbor a few doors down. The dispute was about a shared driveway. The neighbor, a man named Bob, claimed a perpetual easement on the driveway to get to his garage. He even had a signed, notarized document. The article described how Bob and the Harrisons had been in a protracted legal battle for years, and how Bob had eventually gotten so frustrated he had set fire to the Harrisons' garage. Mark felt a jolt of ice water run down his spine. The name. Bob wasn't what got him, it was a specific detail. The article mentioned that Bob's legal counsel had been a woman with a blonde bob, a fierce litigator with a reputation for being ruthless. The article called her a legal bulldog and quoted her saying, "An easement is a legally binding contract, and we will not rest until my client's rights are respected." Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a cold certainty take hold of him. He wasn't just dealing with a crazy neighbor. He was dealing with a woman who had a history of this. A woman who was not just using his grief as a weapon, but had a well-worn playbook for doing it. He went back to the article and found a picture. The womb. The image of the woman in the news article, the one named Karen with the fierce blonde bob, was seared into Mark's mind. It was a mirror of Deborah. The same angular face, the same cold, calculating eyes. His hands trembled as he reread the article, the words blurring together. An easement is a legally binding contract, and we will not rest until my client's rights are respected. It was a creed of malice, a well-rehearsed line from a well-practiced puppeteer. This wasn't a spontaneous act of a frustrated neighbor. It was a campaign, a calculated, methodical assault on a new victim. Mark grabbed his phone, the contact for his lawyer Ken a beacon in the storm. It was late, but he didn't care. "Ken," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "I think I found something big. It's not Deborah, it's a pattern." He relayed the details of the news article, the arson, the shared driveway, and the uncanny resemblance of the lawyer, Karen, to Deborah. Ken listened in silence, the quiet pause on the other end of the line more telling than any exclamation. "Doppelganger lawyer?" Ken finally said, his voice flat. "It's a theory, Mark, but it's not a legal one. Still, it gives us a new angle. This Karen person might be a relative, or maybe they are connected in some other way. It gives us a reason to look at this beyond just a petty neighbor dispute. It gives us motive." "We have to find the Harrisons, Ken. The people who lived here before me," Mark said, his mind racing. "They must know something. They lived through this with this woman, or her twin. They're the only ones who can tell us the truth." Ken agreed. He had the resources to find people who didn't want to be found. "I'll get my assistant on it first thing in the morning. We'll start with the title records. The Harrisons had to have left a forwarding address." The next morning, Mark woke with a newfound purpose. The grief that had weighed him down had been replaced by a fierce, protective anger. The emptiness of the pool was no longer a symbol of his loss, but a battlefield. He walked out onto the deck, coffee in hand, to a new horror. A long green garden hose snaked from Deborah's yard over the fence and into his half-drained pool. A gentle stream of water, a pathetic trickle, was being used to fill his pool, one drop at a time. It was an act of pure, unadulterated provocation. He stomped over to the fence, pulling the hose out of his yard. "Deborah!" he yelled, his voice echoing in the quiet morning. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Deborah emerged from her house, a cheerful, almost bubbly expression on her face, a complete contrast to her previous demeanor. "Oh, Mark, you're up. Just tending to my property. The water level was getting dangerously low. It's a hazard, you know." Someone could fall in and sue me. She smiled, a saccharine, fake smile that didn't reach her eyes. Since I have the easement, it's now my legal responsibility to maintain it. And that means keeping it from becoming a drought-ridden public health hazard. Mark's hands balled into fists. You don't have an easement. You have a piece of paper that my lawyer says is worthless, and this is my property. Get your hose off my land and don't ever put it back. Deborah's smile didn't falter. Oh, I'm sure your lawyer said that, but my lawyer, Karen, says otherwise. And since we're in a legal dispute, it's best we both act as if my claim is valid until a judge says otherwise. Wouldn't you agree? I'm simply acting in good faith to protect what is rightfully mine. She was baiting him, pushing him to a breaking point. Mark knew that any physical act on his part would be exactly what she wanted. He would be the one who looked unstable, who looked like a menace. He took a deep breath, fighting down the urge to rip the hose from the spigot. He simply coiled it up and threw it over the fence into her yard. I will have a restraining order against you by the end of the day, Deborah. You stay off my property. Oh, I'm sure you will, dear, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. But until then, I'm just here doing my part. After all, if I'm not careful, who knows what might happen to my beautiful pool? She gave him a final, triumphant wave and went back inside, leaving Mark simmering with a rage he hadn't felt since before Sarah's death. A few days later, Ken called with news. He had found the Harrisons. They had moved to a small town in Arizona, seeking a quiet life. Ken had a phone number, but he warned Mark to be careful. They may not want to talk about it, Mark. A lot of people just want to move on from a legal nightmare. Be gentle, be respectful, and be prepared for them to hang up. Mark took a deep breath and dialed the number. A woman with a soft, tired voice answered. Hello? Hi, my name is Mark, he began, his voice shaky. I bought your old house, the one on Primrose Lane. I'm calling because, well, I'm in a bit of a situation with your old neighbor, Deborah. A long pause. Mark could hear a man's voice in the background, a low murmur. Is she making a fuss about the pool? The woman, whose name was Helen, finally asked. Yes, Mark said, his voice filled with relief. She's claiming she has an easement. She even brought the police here. She's got this paper, and she says the pool is now hers. Another long silence. Then a man's voice, gruff and weary, came on the line. Listen, son, we don't want any trouble. We moved out here to get away from it all. It was a man named David Harrison. I know, and I'm so sorry to bother you, Mark said, his heart pounding. But she's threatening me with a lawsuit. She's trying to take my pool, the one I bought with the house. She even brought her lawyer, a woman named Karen, into it. I saw a news article about you, about a shared driveway and arson. Was that her? Too? There was a sudden, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Arson? David said, his voice thin with disbelief. That wasn't her. That was a different situation. But the lawyer, the woman, that was her. It was all her. Who was she? Mark pressed. Was she Deborah's sister? Her twin? Another pause, this one longer than the others. Mark heard Helen's muffled voice, something about telling him everything. Then David's voice, strained and full of pain, came back. Listen closely, son. This is the truth. The Karen from that news article. That's not a different person. That's her. That's Deborah. Deborah Peterson. She has a law degree, son. She has a law degree, and she knows the law better than anyone I've ever met. And she uses it like a weapon. Mark felt the blood drain from his face. The world seemed to stop spinning. The woman with the fake smiles, the self-righteous indignation, the constant need for control, she wasn't just a bitter neighbor. She was a lawyer, and the detective who had accompanied her to the house, the silent man named Carter, suddenly took on a new and terrifying significance. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated, planned, and utterly ruthless move. But why would she do this? Mark whispered, his mind reeling. Because she's a predator, David said, his voice raw with emotion. She gets a thrill out of this. She doesn't want the pool. She just wants to own you, to control you. She did it to us for years over. The driveway. We just gave up. We gave her the easement, and she still found ways to make our lives miserable. We sold the house and we ran. We just ran. She's not a neighbor, son. She's an anaconda, and she's got you in her coils now. As Mark hung up the phone, a new, cold clarity settled over him. This wasn't a legal problem. This wasn't a property dispute. This was a war with a skilled, intelligent, and utterly merciless opponent who knew the legal system inside and out. And he had just been given the name of the phone call with the Harrisons replayed in Mark's head like a broken record. She's a lawyer. She uses the law like a weapon. She's an anaconda. Every word was a venomous bite, injecting a cold, hard clarity into his mind. Deborah wasn't a neighbor with a grievance. She was a calculated predator, a puppeteer with a law degree. The pleasant-faced detective, Carter, was not a coincidence. He was part of the plan, a carefully placed pawn in her game of psychological warfare. The police visit wasn't a call for help. It was a performance designed to intimidate and confuse. His grief, which had been a heavy blanket, was now a furnace. The sorrow for Sarah, for the life they'd lost, had transmuted into a searing, protective rage for the life he still had to live. He would not run. He would not be another victim. He was going to fight back. He called Ken, his voice devoid of the panic and desperation from their last conversation. Ken, I know her game. The Harrisons told me everything. She's a lawyer. She has a history of this. She tried the same thing with them over a driveway. She's not just a crazy neighbor. She's a professional. Ken was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. A lawyer, you say? And she came with a detective? This is a major breach of professional ethics, if not an outright abuse of power. A lawyer cannot impersonate or present herself as an uninvolved party in a legal dispute. This changes everything, Mark. This isn't just about the easement anymore. This is about her professional conduct. We have a new plan. The new plan was not a defensive one. It was an offensive. Ken laid it out with the surgical precision of a seasoned litigator. They would immediately file a motion to quiet title, a legal action to declare the easement invalid and his ownership of the pool clear. They would also file a motion for discovery, demanding all documents and communications related to the alleged easement, including any correspondence with the Harrisons, and most importantly, her own legal license and her relationship with Detective Carter. She's trying to play hardball, Mark, Ken said, his voice now a low, determined growl. We're going to show her we can play harder. We're going to expose her for what she is. Armed with a newfound resolve, Mark spent the next few days in a state of controlled fury. He was no longer reacting, he was preparing. He cataloged every interaction with Deborah, every threat, every veiled insult. He even found a public record of her law license, confirming the Harrison's story. Her full name was Deborah Jane Peterson, and she was a licensed attorney in the state. The Karen from the news article had been her, a younger, more ruthless version of the woman who now lived next door. Then, the mail arrived. Tucked inside an innocuous-looking envelope was a certified letter from the city clerk's office. It was a lien, a property lien, filed against Mark's house. The reason? Non-compliance with a legally binding easement. She wasn't waiting for a judge. She was using her knowledge of the legal system to bypass due process and inflict financial pain. The lien, even if ultimately found to be invalid, would make it impossible for Mark to sell his house, refinance his mortgage, or do anything with his property. It was a vicious, preemptive strike. Mark felt the familiar sting of rage, but this time, he didn't give in to it. He called Ken, his voice cold and steady. "She filed a lien on my house." Ken's response was a sharp, humorless laugh. "Well, that's rich. She's moving from civil dispute to outright fraud. A lien can only be filed against property for a debt. She hasn't provided any services and you don't owe her any money. We'll file a motion to dismiss with prejudice and hit her with sanctions for filing a frivolous and fraudulent claim. This is a gift, Mark. She's overplayed her hand." But Deborah wasn't done. The next day, a small, official-looking sign appeared at the edge of his pool. It was a bright yellow notice with a bold red font that read, "Warning, hazardous condition, do not enter, property of Deborah Peterson." A small, official-looking chain-link fence had been placed around the perimeter of the half-filled pool. The fence was flimsy, but it was there, a visual testament to her claim. Mark stood on his deck, staring at the scene. She was not just fighting him in court, she was fighting him in public, on his own land. He walked over to the pool and looked at the sign. He saw his reflection in the muddy water, a man with a haunted look in his eyes. The grief for Sarah was still there, but it was now a ghost, a silent observer to the battle unfolding. He picked up his phone and called Ken. "I need you to find everything you can on Detective Carter. Everything. His employment records, his family, his friends. I need to know why he was there. I need a connection." A few hours later, Ken called back. "I've been looking into Detective Carter. I can't find anything, but I have a contact on the force. They said he was temporarily detailed to the city council's legal department. And guess who just happens to be a legal consultant for the city council on zoning and land use issues? A woman named Deborah Peterson." Mark's blood ran cold. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just a friendly police escort. Carter was her associate. He was working for her, under the guise of an official. The very system meant to protect him had been twisted and weaponized by her. The weight of this betrayal, this systemic corruption, was almost unbearable. He had a formidable enemy who not only had a well-worn playbook, but had collaborators. The final hammer blow came in an email from Ken, a document attached. It was a copy of the deed to the property next door, Deborah's house. And there, buried in the fine print, was a startling revelation. The deed was an easement-based deed, and its legal description included a shared party wall and a shared driveway with the next-door neighbor. The very property that had been the subject of the legal dispute with the Harrisons. The paper in her hand about the pool was a lie. The real target was his entire property, and the pool was just her first salvo in a much larger war. She wasn't just claiming his pool. She was claiming a piece of his house. And in her carefully constructed legal labyrinth, the pool was just a path to the front door. The email from Ken was a roadmap to victory, a meticulously drawn blueprint for a war he had not chosen. Deborah's house, not his pool, was the true prize. The easement-based deed for her property was the key, a legal Trojan horse designed to grant her rights to the shared wall and driveway, which would in turn grant her dominion over his life. It was a cold, cruel, and brilliant plan, and Mark felt a grim admiration for its ruthlessness. But Ken had found the chink in her armor. "We're going to hit her on 3 fronts," Ken had explained. "First, a motion to dismiss her fraudulent lien and demand sanctions. That'll sting. Second, we're going to file a complaint with the State Bar Association about her abuse of her legal license and her impersonation of a concerned citizen. And third, we're going to file a formal ethics complaint against Detective Carter with the police department, citing his involvement in what amounts to a shakedown." Mark felt the weight of grief for Sarah lift, replaced by a steely resolve. This was a battle for his home, for his sanity, and for the peace that she would have wanted him to have. The plan was set in motion. Ken filed the motions, and the documents were served. A week later, Mark received an email from Ken with a subject line that made his heart leap. "She's been served." Mark sat on his deck, the morning sun finally warm on his face. The half-filled pool was still there, but it no longer felt like a symbol of loss. It was a monument to his newfound strength. The flimsy yellow sign and the chain-link fence were a joke, a monument to Deborah's arrogant overconfidence. Just then, he heard the screen door slam next door. He looked up. Deborah, her usual poised demeanor replaced by a strained, furious expression, strode out onto her deck. Her blonde bob seemed less coiffed and more like a furious helmet. She carried a steaming mug of coffee, but her hand trembled. Slightly. "Mark," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "What in God's name have you done?" Mark didn't flinch. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, Deborah," he said, his voice calm and even. "I'm just a simple homeowner minding my own business." "Don't play coy," she spat, brandishing a letter in her other hand. It was an official-looking document, the same kind Ken had sent him. "This is a frivolous lawsuit, a fraudulent and malicious attack on me, a law-abiding citizen." "You're going to regret this, Mark. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." "Oh, but I do," Mark said, a cold smile forming on his face. He stood up and walked to the fence, looking her straight in the eye for the first time. "I know. You're game, Deborah. I spoke to the Harrisons. I know who you are. I know what you did to them. I know you're a lawyer, and I know that Karen is you." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And I know that your real goal wasn't my pool. It was my party wall and my driveway. You want to own a piece of my house, and I know Detective Carter works for you, and that the two of you are abusing your positions for personal gain. That's not just a neighbor dispute, Deborah. That's a crime." Deborah's face went from red with rage to a ghostly white. The carefully constructed facade, the years of practice, crumbled in an instant. The legal bulldog, the predator, was now just a woman caught in a lie. You have no proof," she stammered, her voice weak. "You have nothing but the word of two disgruntled ex-neighbors." "I have the motions Ken filed," Mark replied. "And I have the city's deed records, which I'm sure your legal consultant has already informed you about. We know what you're trying to do, and we're not going to let you do it. The game is over, Deborah." A few weeks later, the final beat came, not with a bang, but with a quiet, satisfying thud. Deborah's fraudulent lien was dismissed with prejudice. The State Bar Association, after a swift and damning investigation, had suspended her law license. Detective Carter was put on administrative leave, a quiet end to a career of corruption. Mark was back in his backyard, but this time he was not alone. Two men from a pool company were there, assessing the damage to the half-drained basin. He was going to have it professionally cleaned, repaired, and retiled. He was going to fill it with clean water, the kind that smelled like new beginnings, the kind that was just his. Just then, he heard a new sound, a sound he had never heard before. It was a moving truck rumbling down the street, and it was pulling into Deborah's driveway. He watched from his deck as two men in jumpsuits began loading her perfectly manicured lawn furniture into the truck. The screen door, the one that had slammed so many times in anger, now stood open, a symbol of surrender. Mark went back to the workers, a small, triumphant smile on his face. The pool would be filled again. The ghost of Sarah would still be there, but now it would be a memory of joy and love, not a source of pain. He had faced his demons, both internal and external, and he had won. He had stood his ground, and in the end, the anaconda, the predator, the woman who had tried to take his life, had simply moved on, leaving him to finally have his peace. And, with a final satisfying click, he started up the new pump and watched as the clean, fresh water began to flow.